My son needed a bone marrow transplant, and I registered as a potential donor without a second thought, the way any father would. The transplant coordinator called 11 days later, her voice careful in a way that told me something was wrong before she said a single word past hello. My name is Callum, and this is the story of the 14 years I spent raising a son I loved completely, only to learn, through what should have been simply an act of trying to save his life, that my wife had known since before he was born that he wasn't biologically mine. I want to explain what my marriage looked like before this discovery, because I think understanding the depth of my trust matters to understanding just how completely this revelation upended my life. My wife Josephine and I met at 26, married 2 years later, and had our son Emmerich roughly a year into our marriage. I have no memory, across our entire relationship leading up to his conception, of any reason to doubt her fidelity or his biological certainty. I remember holding him for the first time in that delivery room with an overwhelming, immediate love I never once, in 14 years, associated with anything other than absolute paternal certainty. Emmerich was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia roughly 9 months before this story starts, a diagnosis that, after an initial round of chemotherapy failed to produce lasting remission, eventually reached the point where his oncologist explained that a bone marrow transplant represented his best remaining path forward. I registered as a potential donor the same afternoon this was raised as an option, understanding without hesitation that I would do whatever was medically possible. I want to walk through the months leading up to that phone call in more detail, because I think the sheer ordinariness of that period matters enormously to understanding how completely blindsided I was by what eventually came out of it. Emmerich's diagnosis had come after nearly 2 months of vague, worsening symptoms, persistent fatigue we initially attributed to a growth spurt, unexplained bruising, a series of colds that never seemed to fully resolve, the kind of slow-building parental worry that eventually tips over into genuine alarm once enough small things stack up together. The actual diagnosis, when it finally came, landed with the specific, flattening force that I think anyone who has sat in a pediatric oncology consultation room will recognize immediately. An entire ordinary life reorganizing itself around a single word delivered by a doctor who has clearly had to say it to other frightened parents many times before. I want to describe the specific instinct I felt the moment donor testing was raised as a possibility, because I think it matters to understanding just how completely unprepared I was for what that testing would eventually reveal. There was no hesitation in me at all, none of the careful weighing of risks and logistics that I understand some potential donors experience. I signed the consent forms the same afternoon, in the same hospital hallway where the option was first mentioned, driven by an entirely uncomplicated, instinctive certainty that this was simply what a father does when his child needs him. I want you to understand that certainty, because it's the exact certainty that made the phone call 11 days later so completely disorienting. I want to describe the specific, disorienting quality of that phone call, sitting in my car outside the hospital when the transplant coordinator's number appeared on my screen, expecting simply to hear whether I was a match. "Mr. Faraday, I need to discuss something with you directly, and I want you to know this conversation is completely confidential," she began, her careful tone immediately signaling something significant. Our HLA typing panel includes markers that can indicate biological relationship. Based on these results, I need to inform you that the genetic profile doesn't support a biological parent-child relationship with Emmerich. I want to try to describe the vertiginous shock of hearing this, sitting alone in that car, trying to process a statement that fundamentally contradicted 14 years of my entire understanding of my own family. "That's not possible," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "I've been his father since he was born. There has to be some error." The coordinator, with what I understand now was genuine professional compassion, gently explained that errors of this specific kind were extremely rare and offered to arrange independent secondary testing to confirm with absolute certainty, understanding, I think, exactly how devastating this information could be for a family and wanting to make sure I had every possible reason to trust the result before acting on it. I want to describe the 9 days between that call and the confirmed secondary results, because they were, without question, some of the strangest days of my entire life. I continued going to work. I continued driving Emmerich to his outpatient appointments, sitting beside him in waiting rooms, making the same small jokes I always made to keep his spirits up before a blood draw. I did all of this while carrying, silently, a piece of information that I understood, even before it was formally confirmed, was almost certainly going to detonate everything I believed about my own family. I want to be honest that I don't fully know how I managed to function normally during that stretch, except to say that Emmerich's ongoing medical crisis left me, in some strange way, with no other choice. He needed a stable, present father during those 9 days regardless of what I was privately carrying. And so I simply, somehow, became that for him while the rest of it waited. The secondary results arrived 9 days later, confirming everything the initial panel had suggested. I was not Emmerich's biological father. I want to describe the conversation I finally had with Josephine, roughly 2 weeks after that initial call, once I'd received the confirmed results and could no longer continue functioning as though nothing had changed. I laid both sets of results on our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of ordinary family dinners, and asked her directly whether she had known. I remember noticing, even amid my own devastation, how quickly her expression shifted from confusion to something that looked unmistakably like the exhaustion of someone finally setting down a burden they'd been secretly carrying for a very long time. She didn't attempt denial. She sat down heavily across from me and, after a long silence, said, "I need you to know I've wanted to tell you for years. I just never found a way that didn't feel like it would destroy everything." What followed was one of the most painful conversations of my entire life. Josephine slowly, haltingly explaining a truth that had apparently existed underneath our entire marriage since before Emmerich was even born. Roughly 2 months before his conception, during a period we'd been going through what I remembered at the time as simply an ordinary rough patch, she'd had a brief relationship with a former colleague she'd reconnected with at a conference. "I ended it almost immediately," she told me. "When I found out I was pregnant, the timeline was close enough that I genuinely didn't know at first whether you or he was the father. I told myself, since we were together, since you were the one who'd actually be his father in every way that mattered, the biology almost didn't matter. You let me believe for 14 years that he was completely mine," I said, my voice breaking despite my effort to maintain composure. "Every middle of the night feeding. Every time I told people how much he looked like my own father. You knew this whole time there was a real chance none of that biological connection existed." Her explanation for the sustained silence, fear that telling me, even early on, would make me leave, would make me resent him, would collapse the family we'd built, didn't meaningfully reduce the devastating weight of the deception itself. But it did, I want to be honest, help me understand the shape of the decision even while I couldn't yet forgive it. I want to describe the specific quality of the silence that fell over our kitchen after she finished explaining, because I think it's worth naming honestly. It wasn't the silence of two people with nothing left to say. It was the silence of two people who both understood, at exactly the same moment, that the conversation had just crossed from something that could still theoretically be smoothed over into something that would permanently, irreversibly reshape the rest of both our lives, regardless of what either of us said next. I remember staring at the 2 lab reports on the table between us, the same clinical fonts, the same institutional letterhead, and thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that I could point to the exact hour my entire adult life had quietly split into a before and an after. I asked her, eventually, the question I think everyone in this position eventually needs to ask, even though I already suspected there was no answer that would satisfy me. "Did you ever come close to telling me? At any point in 14 years, was there ever a moment you almost did?" She told me yes, several times, she said, including once when Emmerich was around after he'd said something at a family gathering about looking nothing like my side of the family, a comment everyone else in the room had laughed off as an innocent childhood observation, but that had apparently sent her into a private panic that lasted for weeks. She said she'd sat down at that same kitchen table one evening, fully intending to tell me, and had lost her nerve within minutes of me walking through the door, deciding, in that specific moment, that the risk of destroying an otherwise happy family outweighed whatever relief honesty might have eventually brought. I want to describe the exhausting process of navigating the following months, understanding I now faced an impossibly complex set of overlapping crises. Profound betrayal regarding my marriage, genuine complicated grief regarding my biological relationship to Emmerich, while simultaneously needing to remain completely present and stable for a son still in the middle of a genuine medical crisis requiring an urgent transplant. I want to be direct about something that became immediately, viscerally clear to me despite everything else being upended. My love for Emmerich as my son remained completely unchanged by this revelation. I want to tell you about the specific, quiet moments during that period that I think mattered most, even though none of them were dramatic. Driving Emmerich to a follow-up appointment about a week after the confrontation with Josephine. Both of us sitting in comfortable silence, him half asleep against the window the way he always was on early morning drives. I remember looking over at him and feeling the exact same overwhelming, uncomplicated love I'd felt holding him for the first time 14 years earlier. A love that, I realized in that moment, had never actually depended on the biological fact I'd just learned wasn't true. That drive, more than any single conversation with Josephine, was the thing that ultimately anchored me through everything that followed. The medical crisis, meanwhile, could not simply pause. Emmerich still urgently needed a compatible donor, a search that now needed to proceed without my own participation, given the biological reality the initial testing had revealed. Josephine and I ultimately decided, after extensive discussion and several sessions with a family therapist specifically navigating this complex decision, that identifying the biological father made sense given the medical urgency. Understanding his family might include additional compatible candidates beyond what our existing extended family could provide. The biological father, a man named Thaddeus, whom Josephine eventually located through the same professional network that had originally reconnected them, responded to this unexpected revelation with genuine shock followed by an immediate willingness to undergo testing himself. Thaddeus, as it turned out, wasn't himself a match, though his younger sister, Emmerich's biological aunt, a woman he'd never known existed, proved to be genetically compatible and, after extensive additional conversations and medical evaluation, agreed to undergo the donation procedure. I want to describe the surreal experience of Emmerich's transplant. Successfully performed roughly 5 months after that initial devastating phone call, with donor marrow from a biological aunt he'd never previously known existed, present in the waiting room alongside Josephine and me, a woman who was, in the most literal biological sense, more genetically connected to my son than I was, despite my having raised him for his entire life. I want to be honest about the complicated ongoing process of processing my relationship with Emmerich throughout this period, understanding that even while my love for him remained completely unchanged, I found myself navigating a genuinely complex grief regarding the biological connection I'd always assumed existed, a grief that felt, at times, almost impossible to fully articulate given how completely it existed alongside continued undiminished paternal love. I want to describe the difficult conversation Josephine and I eventually had with Emmerich himself, roughly 7 months after his successful transplant. Once he'd sufficiently recovered, and we'd had extensive guidance from a family therapist regarding how to approach this in an age-appropriate way that honored both the biological truth and the unchanged permanent reality of my role as his father. "So you're still my dad," Emmerich said during this conversation, a statement carrying both a question and, I think, a need for explicit reassurance. "I am completely, permanently your dad," I told him. "Nothing about this changes that, not even a little bit. I've been your father since the day you were born, and I'll be your father for the rest of my life, regardless of anything about biology." I want to describe my relationship with Josephine in the time since, a process that has involved extensive individual and couples therapy, genuine ongoing struggle to rebuild trust that was so fundamentally violated by 14 years of sustained deception, alongside a complicated, persistent love for the family we'd built together despite everything. I want to be honest that Josephine and I remain married, a decision that surprised some people we've shared this story with. Our decision to attempt continued reconciliation rather than divorce emerged from extensive therapy and genuine reflection regarding what actually mattered most throughout this crisis. Not erasing 14 years of deception, which remains a permanent, significant wound in our relationship, but weighing that devastating breach against 14 years of otherwise genuine partnership, and against my own unconditional commitment to remaining fully present in Emmerich's life regardless. I want to describe the ongoing work our marriage has required since. Rebuilding trust after this level of sustained deception isn't a process that resolves quickly or completely. It requires continued, deliberate effort, extensive therapy, and Josephine's sustained, demonstrated commitment to a transparency our marriage clearly lacked throughout its earlier years. It's been just over 2 years now since that phone call in my car outside the hospital. Emmerich has fully recovered from his transplant, thriving as a healthy, energetic 16-year-old with no ongoing complications from either the original diagnosis or the procedure itself. My relationship with him remains, in every practical, emotional sense that actually matters, completely unchanged. I remain unambiguously his father, a role I've never once doubted despite everything else this experience upended. I've developed, since this happened, an unexpected but genuinely meaningful relationship with Thaddeus and his sister, the woman whose marrow now sustains my son's health. We navigate a careful, evolving extended family dynamic none of us ever anticipated needing to build, one that has ultimately added genuine additional support and connection to Emmerich's life rather than the destabilizing complication I initially feared it might represent. I think, often, about the specific irony embedded in how this entire truth finally surfaced. Not through some ordinary marital conflict or suspicion, but through my own instinctive, uncomplicated love for my son, registering as a donor without a single moment of hesitation. Only to have that very act of love reveal a truth that had been carefully, deliberately hidden from me for 14 years. If you've ever discovered a fundamental truth about your family that had been deliberately concealed from you for years, forcing you to reconcile deep, unconditional love with genuine, significant betrayal, I want to hear how you navigated holding both of those realities simultaneously. I used to believe that biological parentage and deliberate deception about it represented questions with relatively clear, obvious answers about how a person should respond. I've learned, in the most complicated way possible, that love, once genuinely built over years of actual daily presence and commitment, doesn't simply dissolve in the face of biological truth, even when that truth arrives wrapped in a betrayal significant enough to fundamentally alter everything else about how you understood your own family and marriage.